I love my 3DS. It's probably one of my favorite handhelds that have ever been created. It's just so fun and unique compared to all the other handhelds that we've had so far, and truly offers an experience unique on its own. It has an amazing library of games, offering anything from classic 2D Marios to Pokemon, and even some stellar 3D Mario games. So after so many years of awesome support from Nintendo, a couple years ago at this point, have completely shuttered the eShop and all the things, manufacturing about that ended like 5 years ago, 6 years ago probably. But now, almost 12 years since the original reveal of the 3DS, should you buy a 3DS for emulation specifically? Because in those 12 years, basically, we have seen just a massive improvement in terms of the homebrewing and overall hacking scene for the 3DS. The 3DS is capable of so many interesting things thanks to homebrew, and has truly become one of the more interesting handhelds out there. And much like the Vita, has kind of had this cult following, allowing people to port games to this, allowing for just pretty interesting things to happen overall with this device. So I decided to evaluate the 3DS as a dedicated emulation handheld. Does it make sense as a dedicated device for emulation? Does it offer enough performance, compatibility? Does it have enough power to emulate all the console you might possibly want to? And that's what I made this video to sort of evaluate. I love the 3DS, and it could have a very long life after the fact that you might not want to play all the 3DS games out there. And once you do play all those 3DS games, the 3DS starts to lose its value. But can it have an extended life thanks to retro games? The process to get your 3DS to the point where you can homebrew games is fairly easy. It takes about 15 minutes. I will leave a link down below to the guide I used. And overall, it was a pretty decent experience overall to mod my 3DS. And Nintendo has tried to sort of nip this in the bud, but they haven't really tried anything recently, and I doubt Nintendo will consider patching out these exploits eventually, so I feel like it's a pretty safe bet to mod your 3DS as it is now. You're not going to get banned or anything like that. But overall, the experience of actually modding my 3DS, while a little tedious, was relatively painless. It was just about 15 minutes of moving a microSD card back and forth, dumping files onto it, making sure I have the correct things for Luma 3DS, all the other things I need for, like the eShop and all that stuff pre-installed, so I didn't have to worry about doing that after the fact. Moving on to some of the initial things I did with my 3DS. The 3DS, of course, by its very namesake, is one of the best ways to play 3DS games. So I installed the eShop, allowing me to have basically full access to the eShop, even though Nintendo has since deprecated that application. Out of everything I've done in this video, this one is definitely sort of turbo illegal, so don't tell Nintendo, or pretend I didn't say any of that, and I did this all allegedly. Anyways, after that I installed the Homebrew launcher, allowing me to have access to all the Homebrew softwares I would like to download, and even that allowed for some even ported games. Things like the original FNAF games were available to be downloaded on that, which was interesting. I mean, the last game I thought I'd be playing on a 3DS was Five Nights at Freddy's, so it runs decent enough. It kind of feels like it's using the old Android versions of these games, but I can't confirm whether or not that is the case, but it ran fine, and it was FNAF. It wasn't particularly scary considering the fact that it was running at such a low resolution, but it also was still FNAF, so if it was scary enough. After messing around with some of the ported games, like even Sonic Mania got ported to it, which was a Switch game, so that's pretty neat to see on this system. But after messing around with some homebrew titles, I finally decided to get into the emulation stuff. I installed RetroArch, SNES 9X, NES emulator, forget what it was called, and a dedicated emulator for Game Boy Advance, Twilight, for original DS games. I also installed the PS1 emulator, but I'll get into that later. The overall experience when it comes to emulating Super Nintendo and NES was pretty good, though I found myself finding it not as necessary to, use those emulators, because thanks to having the eShop installed, I was able to download all the Virtual Console games. And those were basically all the games I would have emulated in the first place, which, while not technically native support, ran amazing, and it had just a much nicer user interface and was just overall nicer to use the Virtual Console versions over the original emulated versions on the system. It's very similar to how the PS Vita had native support for PS1 games and PSP games. By virtue of having these games natively available on their system, they dramatically deter the amount of people that would have emulated them in the first place. Now that the eShop is gone though, that doesn't necessarily leave a lot of options out there, but since they hadn't made these available before, and thanks to things like the eShop being able to, just natively download them back onto your 3DS, I don't see any reason why you would want to emulate some of these more classic systems, especially things like Genesis, Super Nintendo, NES, with all those games being natively available on the 3DS, unless you don't have a new 3DS. Because Nintendo originally limited the new 3DS systems to have access to all the Super Nintendo games, and only the NES games were available on the original 3DS. So if you have one of those original 3DSs or 3DS XLs, or even 2DS, you would be unable to play most of those Virtual Console games. But now, thanks to these emulators coming to the system, you can now play all those classic system games. Same thing applies to Game Boy. It ran perfectly fine, but I didn't really see any necessary reason to emulate them on the system when I could just download any of the games I really wanted to play anyways off the Game Boy directly from the eShop. So take that as like, it runs great. I tested the emulator, it plays just fine, just felt unnecessary. Same thing goes for the NES. Obviously, it runs phenomenally. But why would I want to do that when I could just natively play them on the 3DS in the first place? Moving to some of the more hardcore stuff. N64 just doesn't run good enough on the system. And you'd think it might run half decent, but overall the experience isn't great. There was a port of Mario 64 made for the system, and that runs fine. But outside of that, most of the other N64 titles, at least in my experience, didn't run especially great. Doesn't make sense to buy this for that reason, especially. So I'm a little disappointed in the N64 performance, but it doesn't really matter when there are so many other good games to play. But it does sort of hurt this device in terms of the value department, especially when comparing it to other devices if you're looking for a dedicated emulation handheld. Now, bringing back to the aforementioned PS1 emulator. I was kind of excited about being able to play PS1 on this system, but I found it rather hit or miss. Thankfully, the 3DS actually has enough buttons to play most PS1 games, and especially if you have sort of the new 3DS or the new Nintendo 2DS XL, those were able to play PS1 games better, but it just wasn't enough performance to get there all the way for certain games. Some games ran fine, like Symphony of the Night ran just fine, but if you tried playing something like Resident Evil 2, it was just kind of stuttery and laggy. I feel like it could be done better with some future optimization, but I'm not going to recommend the device for PS1 emulation based on the hopes of what it could become eventually if developer support is there. So if you were looking for this to play PS1 games, I wouldn't simply buy this at all. The last section for emulation is going to be for Nintendo DS. Thanks to this fact that this is a 3DS, it has basically native support for any Nintendo DS game, but through Twilight you were able to back up all your DS games to be able to play them digitally on your system. It's a fairly easy thing to do, and you could also just download them from your computer and put them onto your 3DS, but it's a little bit more complicated that way. But overall, to be expected that Nintendo DS games run phenomenally, and thanks to stuff like Forwarder allowing me to bring my DS games from Twilight forward onto my home screen, I can have all my games in one spot, which is a pretty fun thing to do. It truly could look kind of ridiculous once you start having all your games on your home screen. Now that we've talked about all the emulation and game compatibility things happening on the 3DS, should you buy a 3DS for emulation? And I gotta say, no. As a dedicated emulation device, it makes a fairly weak argument. The Vita would make more sense, but the 3DS in recent months have been getting pretty expensive, ranging about from $200 to $250 for new Nintendo 3D XLs, and around $150 to $200 for standard new 3DSs, and the rest of it is the original 3DS, 2DS, and 3DS XL, all basically from like $80 to like $150 depending on condition and which model you have. 2DS XLs are a little all over the place because there are so many different limited editions for that device that pricing is a little bit more variable. But I've seen them as low as $150 and as expensive as like $500 if it's a particularly rare model. So I wouldn't necessarily buy that model if you were looking for one of these devices, but overall, the 3DS isn't a great device for a dedicated emulator, but it makes an argument for it being a pretty solid handheld on its own, having access to a massive amounts of Nintendo's back catalog natively without requiring you to do any emulation in the first place. But what do you guys think? I would love to hear what you guys think about this down below. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media garbage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.